So the surah itself is unique in many ways, and so you see the events happening. So we closed off last time with Yusuf alayhi salam giving us a lesson in how to make da'wah, that every opportunity is an opportunity for da'wah, that he was put in prison with two other people that saw him as a good person, and they asked him questions about the dreams that they're having. One of the miracles of Yusuf alayhi salam was this capability of dream interpretations. And so he interprets their dreams, and in the process of doing dream interpretation, he explains to them that this is only from the knowledge of Allah. He explains to them what Islam is about. He explains to them that Allah wants us to worship Him. He gives us a lesson in how to make da'wah to others in every possible way. He talks to them about the fact that all these other creations that people are worshiping, and this is especially true in their society. So, if you talk, for example, to someone today of a different religion, that coming from a different background, and you speak to them, we don't sit and artificially try to create similarities and make things fit where they don't fit. We don't sit there and say, oh, it's very similar, oh, it's this, it's that. Foundationally, Islam itself is different to the other systems of belief. We may align on certain manners or certain ways to treat neighbors, but Islam is very different. So he teaches us a lesson in that. And so now, if we're watching this as a series, let's just go back to the series concept. The camera now moves to the king, to the palace of the king, and the king is surrounded by his advisors. And the ayah starts off. If you want to follow in Quran, ayah number 43 of Surah Yusuf, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَقَالَ الْمَلِكُ. And I made a point about why this in of itself, this first statement, is a miracle of the Quran. Does anyone remember what I said about Malik? Why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refer to the king as Malik?
Because he's not from Egypt.
Because he's not Egyptian. Because he's not Egyptian. So this, by the way, in of itself is like I said, a miracle. Because Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or the people, they didn't know this. Because remember, who is the messenger that comes after Yusuf chronologically in the Quran? Later on in Egypt, shows up in Egypt. What's his name? Musa alayhi salam. Musa shows up, and the person running the country is called Fir'aun. Fir'aun is a title, but the Quran is very precise. Every word means something. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He refers to him as the king. And the reason he's called the king in the Quran is he was not from amongst the Egyptians. He was from an occupying force at the time called the Hyksos that originate in sort of the Syria, Lebanon area, and later on they get defeated, and then the title of Fir'aun starts to be the title that covers Egypt, right? So, so this is now a king. إِنِّي أَرَى سَبْعَ بَقَرَاتٍ سِمَانٍ. And so he describes a dream that he's having with his people, that he sees 7 large cows eating 7 small cows, right? So the skinny cows are eating the fat cows. And he also describes this notion of seeing 7 grains of corn that are very green and 7 grains of corn that are completely barren. Completely barren. You think of these movies where there's a strong wind coming through and it's very dry and it's very hot and the crops are all barren. So he sees this. And he doesn't just see this once. This is a recurring dream. This is a recurring dream. If you read the books of Tafsir, this didn't just happen once to him. Are there other parts of the Quran that describe dreams? Do we know of anything in Islamic, Quranic perspective or Seerah perspective where people see dreams? Ibrahim alayhi salam. Ibrahim alayhi salam is described as seeing the dream of, slaughtering his son. What else? Fir'aun had a dream that someone from the Bani Israel is going to come and to overthrow him. And that's why he started to kill, the firstborns of Bani Israel. Even in the Prophet ﷺ, before he had the angel come, Jibreel come, what did he see? One of the signs of prophethood. He had dreams that would occur exactly the way that he saw them. He would have, and he describes this about himself. He said, I started to have these dreams, and I would look around me, and the dream would happen exactly the way I saw it. So this is all from amongst what's described in the Quran. So the king basically says, my chiefs or my advisors, you had mala. When we explain this word mala, what does mala mean in the Quran? Mala is a very recurring word. It's the nobility of the country, the ministers and the businessmen and the thought leaders and the advisors of the White House. They're all called mala. They're the influential people of society that typically support the ruler. أفتوني في رؤياي. So he now wants a fatwa. He wants a fatwa on what he's saying. And they basically come back to him in ayah number 44. قالوا أضغاث أحلام قالوا أضغاث أحلام وما نحن بتأويل الأحلام بعالمين. And they basically say these are just confused visions, man. These are just confused. We don't know what to make of it. We're not experts in interpretation. Out of respect for the king, they don't tell him he's crazy. They don't tell him, oh, you had too much biryani the night before, so your stomach must be hurting. They don't say this to the king. They just say, we can't fix it. We don't know what this is. Like, don't worry about it too much. Don't worry about it too much, right? And then now, who is listening to this conversation? Who is listening to the conversation that's going on between the king and the advisors? The one that was in the prison with Yusuf, the one that survives the event of the prison, right? Because remember, there was two people that were swept inside of the prison. Many of the Mufassirin say they were put in prison because someone tried to poison the king, and they were, like I said, the cops rounded them up, they put them in prison, they find out who it is, that person's crucified, the other person is set free. These are the companions of the prison. So the one that is set free is now the winemaker for the king. So he's hearing these observations. He's like the butler. So now he remembers. And he remembers years after he left the prison, because as he was leaving the prison, what does Yusuf tell him? He says, go and get help for me. Go to your master when you go out and get help for me from your master. Right? Brothers, before I forget, Sheikh Zubayn is ill. He is, just in case some of you have to go, he's at the emergency in Overlake Hospital. And so that's as far as I know, right? He's not really. So for those that can go and visit him, inshallah, they only allow one visitor in the emergency at any point in time. But if you're able to go, let's space it out over the next few days, inshallah, to go and visit him, and we'll make dua for him at the end, inshallah, for shifa. Well, ayah number 45. وَقَالَ الَّذِي نَجَى مِنْهُمَا. So the one that survived from amongst the two that were in prison, وَذَكَّرَ بَعْدَ أُمَّةٍ, suddenly remembers after a long time. This notion of him being forgetful is described in the previous chapter of the series, where the Quran makes him forgetful, which results in Yusuf staying in prison for an extra long period of time. He suddenly remembers. He's like, oh, I remember. There was this guy I was in prison with. He used to be amazing at interpreting these dreams, right? They call him a Siddiq. They call him a Siddiq. What is a Siddiq? Someone who is truthful. There's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ referring to this. What is the hadith? Does anyone know? MashaAllah. So the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ starts off with that the truthful person, a sidq, truthfulness is part of birr. What is birr? Birr means good. Birr means good. So if you're truthful by nature, you're automatically going to lead to good things. The outcomes of what you do, what we do, leads to good things. الصدق يهدي إلى البر والبر, and the birr leads to Jannah. And the person will continue to be truthful until they are written in their books on the Day of Judgment that this person is a truthful person. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us all from those that are truthful. And then the opposite is true. The hadith of the Prophet says, وَإِنَّ الْكَذِبِ يَهْدِي إِلَى الْفُجُورِ. And most certainly, lying leads to fujur, leads to bad manners, bad behaviors. And fujur leads to Jahannam. And the person will continue to lie, right? And they don't just continue to lie, it becomes part of their nature. Some people, just within their nature, certain jobs or whatever, like, oh, this car's fine. There's nothing wrong with this car. I bought this car from now, and they know that the car's had 7 accidents and the engine needs changing and this, they're just, it becomes part of their nature. Right? I'm not saying people that sell cars are all like this. I'm just giving you an example. So, and fujur, leads to no, right? And the person will continue to lie until it is written in their book, this person is a liar. This person is a liar, right? Okay. By the way, did the Prophet, at the time, Sahaba ever give the title Kadhab to anyone? Musaylam al-Kadhab. Right after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, he claimed to be a messenger, he claimed to be a prophet. They immediately gave him the title, Musaylam al-Kadhab. He's liar, 100%. Okay? So he says, I will tell you its interpretation, so send me to Yusuf. He knows Yusuf is trapped in the dungeons of the prison, locked away, 7 corridors. I send me back to this guy in prison, and I'm going to get you the answer. So then he goes to Yusuf alayhi salam, and he says the following. He says, Yusuf ayyuha as-siddiq. Yusuf, man of truth. Man of truth. So you could tell that people, everyone knew he was truthful. Just like the Prophet ﷺ, in early days of Mecca, what did they call him? What was his title? As-Sadiq al-Amin. He was the most truthful, the most honest, right? The most truthful, the most honest. So much so, that even when they hated the Prophet ﷺ, the Quraysh, the leaders of Quraysh, and they called him a liar, a magician, a soothsayer, and by the way, this will happen to all messengers all throughout time. This isn't just a point in time thing. This will happen to the Prophet ﷺ. This is not just it used to happen back then, it doesn't happen today. It happens and it will continue to happen. Right? We need to be smart about how to deal with it. We need to equip ourselves, equip our families, our children, how to respond to it. But we shouldn't keep making it a big deal. One of the famous A'imma, he was once walking and someone called him a name. Someone cursed at him, called him a name. And he didn't respond, he just kept walking. So his student was with him, he's very angry. He's like, Sheikh, this guy just don't you want to go and respond to him? Don't you want to go? He's like, listen, if I'm walking in the street and I trip over a stone, or I trip over a brick, like I was about to fall and then I correct myself, am I going to go back and get in a fight with the brick? I just made him like the brick. Don't worry about it. So these things shouldn't faze us. So the Prophet ﷺ, even before Hijrah, they still kept their amanat with him. The people that hated him still kept their precious items with him. Like, I have this famous painting, I have this money. They wouldn't trust anyone else except for Muhammad ﷺ. So they leave it with him, right? Okay. So he goes back to Yusuf and he says, Yusuf, O man of truth. Is anyone else in the Quran called a truthful man? Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu is called a truthful man. Who else in the Quran? Ibrahim alayhi salam, واذكر في الكتاب إبراهيم إنه كان صديقا نبيا. He was certainly, confirmed the truth and the beliefs, and he was a nabi, he was a prophet, right? So this characteristic can apply to many people, right? Yusuf alayhi salam. Aftina, give us fatwa, because the king will say aftuni, right? Aftina, so this is a fatwa now. في سبع بقرات سمان يأكلهن سبع عجاف. By the way, so he says, Yusuf alayhi Siddiq, Yusuf, O man of truth, come and give us a fatwa in 7 skinny cows eating 7 large cows. By the way, if you're trying to memorize the surah, you'll see one of the easy things is he says the exact same thing that the king said. It's the exact same. He literally quotes the king, right? Give us a fatwa in these 7 skinny cows eating 7 big cows. وسبع سنبلات خضر وأخرى يابسات لعلي أرجع إلى الناس لعلهم يعلمون. So he says, let me know what you think about this so that I can go back to people and tell them what to expect. And remember, I asked this question last time. What does he not say? He does not tell him that the dream is from the king. He conveniently parks that truth. He wants to take whatever reward for himself, right? Okay. So Yusuf does the following, and I want you to really follow carefully what he says. And then we're going to say a comment about what the Prophet ﷺ says about what Yusuf said in response to this man. Okay, so there's actually hadith relevant to these ayat coming. قال, so Yusuf ﷺ responds to him. And he says, تزرعون 7 سنين دأبا فما حصدتم فذروه في سنبله إلا قليلا مما تأكلون ثم يأتي من بعد ذلك 7 شداد يأكلن ما قدمتم لهن إلا قليلا مما تحصنون ثم يأتي من بعد ذلك عام فيه يغاث الناس وفيه يعصرون. 3 ayat. So he gets asked a question, he responds, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala displays the response of Yusuf alayhi salam in 3 ayat. Okay, we're going to take it and analyze it a little bit. So Yusuf alayhi salam responds and he says the following: you will plant grain for 7 consecutive years, leaving in the ear whatever you will harvest except for the little that you eat. Ayah number, first ayah, ayah number 47. Ayah number 48. Then after that will come 7 years of great hardship, which will consume whatever you have saved except the little that you will store for seed. Ayah number 49. Then after that will come a year in which people will receive abundant rain and they will press oil and wine. What did Yusuf just do?
He didn't give complete information.
He
didn't give him the complete information. He gave him
how to do it.
The opposite.
He
not only interpreted the dream, but he also gave him a plan of action for the next week.
That's it. Not only did he interpret the dream, he told him what to do about it, because the interpretation is a scary interpretation. You know the vision of the movie I gave you at the beginning, like there's a dark wind passing through and it's very dry and you see the sand popping up and there's no problem. That's basically the interpretation of the dream. But he not only answers his dream, he tells him what to do about it. What to do about it. What does he not do?
How to do it?
No, actually he tells them how to do it. What does he not do? Put yourself in that position. Put myself in that position. What would you and I have done?
He's not asking any favor.
Yeah.
He's not rebuking why you forgot.
He's not rebuking why you forgot. Dude, if it was like you'd put him in prison, slap him 50 times. Call him, man, you idiot. I told you. He doesn't do any of that. He doesn't do any of that, Yusuf alayhi salam. He is so kind. This is part of the manners of Yusuf alayhi salam. You'll see the same kind of manners with who later? With the brothers. You'll see this exact kind of super high manner. The Prophet ﷺ says Islam is about perfection of manners. Islam is about perfection of manners. How we influence the non-Muslims around us when we live in this community is about how we behave with them, how we help them, how we check on them. It doesn't matter if they're Muslim or non-Muslim. Part of our job is to help them out. The early years of Mecca, the Prophet ﷺ didn't have many converts to Islam. He still fed the poor, he still took care of the poor, he still took care of the orphan, he still took care of the widow. He was demonstrating the manners of the deen he was coming with. Yusuf a.s. was doing the exact same thing. There is no rebuke. He didn't call him names, he didn't. And then the other thing with his brothers and sisters is really important. What did he not do? Ask for a reward. I know the answer. Give me $1 million and then I can tell you. You want to save the economy? Give me $1 million. That's not too much money to pay to save the economy, right? And the Prophet ﷺ, he responds to this. And he says, Wallahi, this is the comment of the, he says, if I was in the situation of Yusuf, I would have not answered the question until they let me out. So, for all the time that he spent in prison, the Prophet ﷺ says, I would have asked to be released from the prison, right? So Yusuf alayhi salam, he answers the question, right? And the other thing about this scene. So you'll see in the seerah of Yusuf alayhi salam, and I think I mentioned this last time, he starts off in a low position where his brothers throw him in the well, yes? And from there on, does it get better or worse? It gets worse. He gets sold as a slave. Then he gets put in prison. But now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is about to uplift him. Like if you're drawing a bar chart and he just went boom, 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 he's about to go boom, right back up to the top. And it starts off with having a commanding position, even from the prison. Even from the prison, he has the information that they need to save the whole country. He's in prison, but he has information to save the whole country, right? So he says to him the following, the first ayah, number 47. He says, Tazra'un means production. Tazra'un means to prep the ground for the harvest. So you will plant da'ban. What does da'ban mean? Da'ban means continuously, and it means hard. Let me give you an example. We're coming up into the holiday season, yes? Is anyone here working at Amazon? Okay, so what's that called in Amazon terms? P-E-A-K, peak, right? They call it a peak. So Amazon calls it a peak. FedEx calls it a peak. UPS calls it why is it a peak?
Festive season. Yes.
So that's all the action. That's where all the action is. People are buying things, shipping things, delivering things. So it's a peak season. So it's all hands on deck. You understand? But it only happens over the next few months. After that, it eases off a little bit. You understand? But it's like we need to hire 5,000 people. We need to pay overtime. We need to make sure everyone puts in their overtime. We need to make sure that, not just with our truck drivers, we need to make sure everyone that can drive a car, Uber, Lyft, whatever, they're ready to go in case those, you understand that mindset? We're preparing, like we're preparing for war. Everyone's on all hands on deck. So this is what that means. So Yusuf alayhi salam says, you're not going to plant it in the harvest cycle that you planted today. You're going to get all the manpower that you can get and plant as hard as you can. for a straight 7 years. Normally you don't do this. Normally it happens in a cyclical way. But you're going to plant as hard as you can for a straight 7 years, right? And you're going to pay all the overtime that you can. And then he says, you will eat what you need. You will leave everything in its harvest, but you will eat the minimum of what you need. The minimum of what you need. So if people are used to going to Costco and buying 50 things for a family of 4, you're going to go to Costco and buy 1 thing for a family of 4, and it should be sufficient. You understand? So he gives them, all right, the first part of the plan. Then he says, and then afterwards, you will have 7 years of great hardship. A famine is going to be throughout the whole land. The economy is going to go into the weeds. You're not going to be able to get any crops. It's going to be a tough 7 years. So what you did the first 7 years was you prepared for it, but now you're going to consume the very little that you need, and then you're going to store some of the seeds in the stores, in the warehouses. You're not going to plant them like you're doing now. Every year, plant, eat 50%, throw away 50%. Like we do this in this country. So much food gets thrown out. So no. Everything that's extra, we're going to put it in a warehouse. There's going to be a warehouse system to organize the delivery to people, make sure that we don't run out of food. The country's about to go into a Great Depression, right? A very tough time, right? And then he says, then after that will come a year in which people will receive abundant rain and they will press oil and wine. After that will come a year when you get abundant rain. Yusuf just gave them the interpretation of the dream, how to fix the problem, a 15-year economic plan. Think about that. 15-year economic plan, not just 1 year, 2 years. People often think like 5 years out, maybe 10 years out. He gives them a 15-year economic plan. Part of the king's dream, does it say anything about 7 years and a year, or does he just say 7 years and 7 years? The king's dream. 7 and 7. Why does Yusuf say, and then you get 1 year with plenty of rain? Why does he say that? Because if you don't get a year of plentiful rain, then the king's dream would have said, we're going to have 9 years where the skinny cows are eating the big cows. We're going to have 10 years of the grains not being on their thing. Do you understand? So Yusuf also from the Wahid of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, obviously, comes to the conclusion that this crisis is a 14-year, it's a 7-year crisis, but it's 14 years in the making, and then there's 1 year, the final year, where things go back to normal. Things go back to normal. You know what I mean? We had, subhanAllah, 18 months of tough time with COVID, and then things go back to normal right after that. So this is what Yusuf says, right? He comes to that conclusion as far as that's concerned. Now, the piece of detail that's important in the last ayah is you will have abundant rain when you press oil and wine. Why is pressing oil and wine the thing that Yusuf calls out? Why does he call it out?
You get a lot of fruits, olives, of which you could maybe with harvesting.
Okay, you get lots of fruits and also?
Normal.
Sorry? Normalcy? What else?
And you also need to plan for your workforce.
Plan for your workforce? All of this is correct. The reason he calls this out is oil and wine is a luxury item. It's not a requirement. It's a luxury item. If you can't eat, you don't go and buy cheesecake. If you can't feed your family, you're going to buy the basics of what you're going to buy: bread, you're going to buy a little bit of meat, a little bit of vegetables. You're not going to buy the extra special items. You're not going to buy Snickers chocolate bars if you can't feed your family. So then he says in the 15th year, when he says pressing oil and wine means there's going to be so much plentiful rain and water is going to come back to normal. The harvest goes back to normal. Where all the luxury items that you have today, you'll be able to get back again because there's going to be extra. What's the fiqh lesson that we learn from this? What Yusuf just did. There's a lesson in fiqh.
Give hope.
Sorry?
Hope.
I can't hear you.
Give people hope.
Give people hope is a good one. Give people hope is excellent. In fact, be merciful is another one, right? The Prophet says, who does not have mercy, doesn't have mercy, right? So give people hope is excellent. What else? There's actually a fiqh opinion that the fuqaha have derived from this particular response of Yusuf that it's okay for a Muslim to participate in a non-Muslim governmental. when the help is for the betterment of the people, you should actually participate to make things better for the people. I'm not talking about going in where they're going to kill Muslims. I'm not talking about that. His plan here is to save the country. His plan here is to save, in fact, you'll see that he doesn't just save the country, he actually saves the whole region. How do we know that he saves the region? His brothers come from a different country. His brothers come from Palestine. And his brothers also have a family. And they're like, there's no place to get the food. Hey, Egypt has food. We should go over there and trade with them. Right? So he doesn't just save the country, he saves actually the entire region. Right? So Yusuf presents a plan that the government can use to fix the government, even though this is a non-Muslim government. The king wasn't Muslim, the Malak weren't Muslim, you understand? So, for example, people that run for Congress and people that run for local elections, that's a good thing. If they're doing it for the betterment of the Muslim community to have representation, that's actually a good thing. Halal thing in this country, right? Okay. So this is now, what happens when he goes to the king. وقال الملك. So clearly, when you see this now, ayah number 50 again, the precision and the beauty of the Quran and not wasting any words. وقال الملك ائتوني به. The king then said, "Bring him to me. Bring him to me." So we understand that the winemaker got this information. He went out of the prison. He went back to the palace. The palace let him in. And he said, "Oh my liege, I'd like to have an audience." He has an audience with the king, and he says, "Hey, the guy I know in prison says this and this and that." So the king is now really intrigued by this person in prison. Like, this is part of what we understand has happened, right? So the king already got the information. وقال الملك ائتوني به. He said, "Bring him to me." فلما جاءه الرسول قال ارجع إلى ربك فسأله ما بال النسوة التي قطعن أيديهن إن ربي بكيدهن عليم. So he goes back to Yusuf alayhi salam, and Yusuf alayhi salam says, "What? Let me out of here and scot free?"
Unless I'm
He wants to get himself exonerated. That's a perfect answer. So he says, "Go back to your master. Go back to the king. And ask him about the women that cut their hands." He just leaves him a tip. He doesn't tell him the whole, he doesn't say, "I was working in the house of Al-Aziz." No. He just says, ask him about the women that cut their hands. He's like, "You're not coming out?" "No, I'm not coming out. I'm staying here until you ask the king." So the guy's like, "What?" Okay, you understand that? So the Prophet ﷺ actually gives us, the Prophet ﷺ says, لو لبثت في السجن ما لبث يوسف ثم أتاني الداعي لأجبته. This is in Sahih Bukhari. The Prophet ﷺ says, if I had stayed in prison as long as Yusuf had stayed, and the da'i came and unlocked the door and said, "Come on out," I would have gone out. The Prophet ﷺ says this, right? So Yusuf sets a very high standard. But what does he not do? What does he not do here? What does he do and what does he not do? He uses cryptic enough language, like if you're an investigator, the king doesn't know what happened. What's the king going to do? What's the king going to do with this information? What would happen? You give it today to someone in the White House. What are they going to do? They're called the head of the CIA. "Hey, I have a message that says blah blah blah, the women that cut their hands. Go and investigate." He goes blah 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 until it gets to the police station. You understand? But they don't have to follow the lead. He gives them a lead. And the lead is pretty easy. Like anyone can, with authority should be able to figure out. And then what's going to happen when they know the answer? That person's going to get the answer, transmit it to their boss, transmit it to their boss, transmit it to their boss until it gets back to who? Back to the king. You understand? Okay. So that's one thing that Yusuf does. He arouses the curiosity of it. What does he not do? What does Yusuf not do?
He did not take the name of
MashaAllah. He did not speak about the name of the master's wife to protect her reputation. Like it was going to get known anyway. He didn't just say, "Oh, it's this person, blah, 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 look how else." He didn't do any of that. He just gives them the tip in a way for them to be able to investigate, to come back with an answer. And he doesn't name anyone to flame them on social media or embarrass them in front of their friends or have another Twitter feed coming out about, "Oh, look what this person," he doesn't do any of that, right? He protects part of his manners, the relationship that he had before. So then the king basically finds out, he brings the women. قال ما خطبكن. So ayah number 51, قال ما خطبكن. The king asked the women, "What did you get when you tried to do this to Yusuf?" إذ راوتن يوسف عن نفسه, as you tried to seduce Yusuf. قلنا حاشا لله ما علمنا عليه من سوء. قالت امرأة العزيز الآن حصحص الحق أنا راودته عن نفسه وإنه لمن الصادقين. So now the scene is the women that were invited to the wife of An-Aziz's house when the event happened, when they cut their hands, they're all showing up in front of the king. And the king says, why did you guys do that to him? He's saying, why did you try to give him a bad reputation? And he ended up being thrown in prison. And he spent all this time in prison for a crime that he never committed. But you can see the king is just like really upset by the situation, right? So the women say, we didn't do anything. All friends that were at the party, they didn't do anything. She says, she now comes clean. She now comes clean. Has al-haqq means what? Has, this word in Arabic. When he plays, speak Arabic. Huh? Be clear, inshallah. Yeah, so if you're hiding something and you uncover it, it's now exposed, it's now cleared up. So she says the truth is now cleared up. And then has al-haqq, right? The truth is clear. And then she says, I am the one that tried to do this. He is mostly, certainly, the most truthful. So she effectively confesses. She comes clean, right? The wife of Al-Aziz. The following ayah, number 52. ذَلِكَ لِيَعْلَمَ أَنِّي لَمْ أَقُلْهُ بِالْغَيْبِ وَأَنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَهْدِي كَيْدَ الْخَائِنِينَ. So next statement is also her statement. From this he should know that I did not betray him in his absence, for Allah certainly does not guide the scheming of the dishonest. And number 53 is also her statement. وَمَا أُبَرِّئُ نَفْسِي إِنَّ النَّفْسَ لَأَمَّارَةٌ بِالسُّوءِ إِلَّا مَا رَحِمَ رَبِّي إِنَّ رَبِّي غَفُورٌ رَحِيمٌ. And I do not seek to free myself from blame, for indeed the soul is ever inclined to evil, except for those shown mercy by my Lord. Surely my Lord is all forgiving, most merciful. Okay, what just happened? Besides the fact that she proclaimed her guilt, what just happened? This is what you would call a confession. In a court of law, this is called a confession. I confess to committing the crime. What else is going on? Sorry? She? Yeah, well, it could be. You're saying she's now Yusuf's religion. Yeah, that's actually a very smart comment. Some of the commentators have said this, that she effectively turns to Islam. She effectively does a tawbah. Do we have other occasions in the Quran where something like this happens? From people that were non-Muslim?
Queen of Saba.
Sorry?
Queen of Saba.
Queen of Saba is a good one. But a similar situation where things got really bad, that they had to make tawbah to Allah or turn back to Allah. Remember the story of the two men in the Surah Al-Kahf? Remember what happens to the one whose garden is destroyed? Right? He basically, at the end, he speaks with regret. He almost speaks, you would say, with tawbah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I wish I hadn't done that. I wish I didn't have this attitude. Where else does this happen? Surah Al-Qalam, right? Surah Noon, remember the boys that inherited the garden from their father and the family, and the father used to give away much of the crops in charity, and as soon as the father dies, what do they say? We're locking it up. We're locking it up. No one else is going to have from the fruits of the garden. The father had this tradition. He would give part of the crops to the poor people. And after the father dies and they inherit, they're like, no one's going to get this at all. No. We're going to lock it up. We're going to lock it up completely. What happens when they're going to look for it? It's completely destroyed. And what do they say at the end? They say, we wish we had done. So you see some of these stories that have a disastrous outcome in dunya. Part of what we learn from it is, that's better than having a disastrous outcome in akhirah. He could lose his business, he could lose his farm, he could lose his house, he could lose his garden, but at the end, if he makes tawbah to Allah, he's going to succeed when he passes away. And that's what's really important, right? So she now has this burden on her of all these years of Yusuf being in prison. Many of the Mufassirin also say her husband had passed away a long time ago. Her father, her husband, the one that had bought Yusuf, the master of the house, had died away. So she was carrying this thing in her heart about him always suspecting what she had done, when she actually didn't do anything. Like she lied to him, she said things about Yusuf that were untrue, but she never actually did anything. You understand? You follow what I'm saying? And so you could also almost always see this, this emotional, this is part of the beauty of the Quran, is not just describing the scene of the conversation, but the emotions of the people. Like, it hurts me to continue to think that he actually doubted me all these years and I actually done something when I hadn't done anything. Right? Okay. So she comes clean, as I said, and she basically says, that he is truthful. And when they say hasha lillah, what is hasha lillah? Hasha lillah. Hasha lillah is like, God forbid. God forbid we would do anything. God forbid he'd do anything, right? Okay. And then, as I said, she says that, I was never dishonest with him. And then this last ayah, number 53, this is important. She says, and I do not seek to free myself from blame. I do not seek to free myself from blame. For indeed the soul is never inclined to evil, except for those shown mercy by my Lord. Surely my Lord is all forgiving, most merciful. What would we call this in Islamic terms, what she just said? What would we call this? يا أيها الذين آمنوا توبوا إلى الله توبة نصوحا. This is called a tawbah. This is her form of a tawbah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? There's many mufassirin stories about the fact that she turns to the religion of Islam, and then Yusuf marries her. Allah, we don't have these details in the Quran. Whether or not she becomes his wife, we don't have any of this, but this is some of this Israeliyat that we got. The Prophet ﷺ says, don't say they're true and don't say they're false, Allah alam. But this effectively comes across as a tawbah from her, right? So that she truly regrets having. Now she says this statement, in the nafsa la'amnaratun bisu. She says, and the soul is ever inclined to evil. The soul is ever inclined to evil. What is this notion of our souls being inclined to evil? Is it a true statement? Is the human soul always inclining towards evil? No. When people say no. You guys said no. You should have at least 2 votes on this side. Okay. How many people say yes? It's always inclined to evil. Okay. Everyone else is like in between, right? So the Prophet ﷺ, in the Quran, actually describes 3 types of souls. 3 types. Right? So it actually comes in 3 flavors. One flavor is definitely called an-nafsul amnara. This is the soul of the person that just constantly, gets them to use bad language, to lie, to cheat, just constantly, right? Like the nafs becomes part of this. The nafs becomes part of what happens with this person's perspective. The second one, that's the no side. No, it's not always, but it's not amnara. It's the exact opposite of that, which is called what? Nafsul mutma'inna. Yeah, nafsul mutma'inna. Yeah, nafsul mutma'inna. The third one is called the nafsul lawwama. Nafsul lawwama. لا أقسم بيوم القيامة ولا أقسم بالنفس اللوامة. What is the nafs al-lawwama? Yeah, no, not contempt. Contempt is the second one. The nafs al-lawwama is in between. Nafs al-lawwama is in between. Actually, most Muslims are nafs al-lawwama. So most of us are the middle one. Now, is it a good one? Is it a good one to be in the middle category, or do you fail? It's a good one. It doesn't quite score the A, it scores like a B or a C, right? Based on what? Why is a nafs al-lawwama a good one? Why? It's not the other one. Okay, so that's like Boolean logic. It's not that one. Yeah.
Eyes always returning back.
Yes.
You're always returning back. You're more closer to Allah.
MashaAllah. Nafs al-lawwama means it's alive. The nafs is still alive. The first one, al-amara bisu, is dead. The nafs itself, not the person is dead. The nafs is dead. You could hammer Quran, you could talk about haram, you could talk about it doesn't matter. The nafs itself, it can be recovered, but for all intents and purposes, it's died. Right? The nafs al-lawwama is still alive. It knows when it has made a mistake. And it can make tawbah, it could make istighfar, it could go to hajj, it could pay sadaqah. The Prophet ﷺ says, you pay a sadaqah, whatever anger Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has goes away. It puts it out like, the sadaqah puts it out like a water puts out a fire, right? So there's things we can do, istighfar, tawbah, being sincere on dua. So this is part of the nafs al-lawwama, right? This is part of the nafs al-lawwama. And this is also mentioned in the Quran, right? In Surah Al-Qiyamah, لا أقسم بيوم القيامة ولا أقسم بالنفس اللوامة. Which means that it can make mistakes and it turns back, right? Now there's another opinion there is another opinion that, these three types of souls, are actually mixed up into one. So the ulama have different tafsirs of it, but there's three separate things, right? And then there's a mixture. There's like an open buffet of all three, and whichever one is like the person is acting on is the one that kind of takes precedence over the others. Although I tend to think the first one is just a little bit easier to understand. And the Prophet ﷺ says, he says every child is born on what? Fitrah. What do you think the fitrah is? Fitrah is Islam. The fitrah is 100% Islam. It doesn't matter. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ has another hadith where he says every child is born on the fitrah of Islam until his parents take him and they make him a Jew or they make him a Christian. It's like a forced conversion from Islam. But he is actually this baby born in Overlake Hospital to John and Mary. That kid is a Muslim. At birth, that kid is a Muslim. Their fitrah is the fitrah of Islam. What then happens to the fitrah throughout time? What happens to the fitrah? The human being is the one that degrades the fitrah through the actions that they take. The person that ends up in the first kind of nafs, the nafs al-amara bisu, they weren't born that way. No one is born a thief. No one is born a killer. No one is born to torture. No one is born that way. But they go through a set of events that they themselves enact and continue to enact until that kind of nafs is the one that takes over. Okay? So this is from the hadith of the Prophet. Okay, so now ayah number 54. وَقَالَ الْمَلِكُ ائْتُونِي بِهِ أَسْتَخْلِصْهُ لِنَفْسِي فَلَمَّا كَلَّمَهُ قَالَ إِنَّكَ الْيَوْمَ لَدَيْنَا مَكِينٌ أَمِينٌ. So the king now says, bring him to me, I will employ him exclusively for my service. What just happened to Yusuf alayhi salam? He went from being in the dungeon of the prison to working for the CEO of Amazon. He's actually doing a better job than the CEO of Amazon. He works for the king of the country. You understand that shift? You understand the change in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? You understand the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala coming in? Do you remember at the very beginning of the surah on the second page when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes him being sold as a slave in Egypt? What does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say about that? Just after the event. وَشَرَوْهُ بِثَمَنٍ بَخْسٍ دَرَاهِمَ مَعْدُودَةٍ وَكَانُوا فِيهِ مِنَ الزَّاهِدِينَ وَقَالَ الَّذِي اشْتَرَاهُ مِصْرَ لِامْرَأَتِهِ لِكَيْ مَثْوَاهُ. So, أَحْسَنَ إِنْ فَعَلَتْ كَذَا كَذَلِكَ كِدْنَا يُوسُفَ كَذَلِكَ مَكَّنَّا يُوسُفَ. In that way, كَذَلِكَ كِدْنَا يُوسُفَ. Anyway, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes him being sold as a slave, and then what is he saying? And in that way we made Yusuf powerful in the land. It's like, how? How does one become powerful in the land by being sold as a slave? This now is Yusuf's popping up. He just goes from being in prison to work. And the king doesn't say, I'm going to have you work for the minister who runs the economy, who has a guy that's a senior director, you can report to him and have a team of 10 people. He says, no, you're going to report to me directly. This vision that he has, and clearly you understand, like, he doesn't just make this decision without seeing him. Like, he sees him, he talks to him, he has what we'll call an interview. He has an interview. Right? It's like, you're a legal guy, you came here to the country, so what? Where were you from? Like, and the king is so impressed. Right? He's so impressed by him. He says, إِنَّكَ الْيَوْمَ لَدَيْنَا مَكِينٌ أَمِينٌ. What is makin and what is amin? Yes? Amin is trusted. Makin? Stable, esteemed, respected, powerful. I'm going to give you authority. You could work in a company where you have someone that's Amin, that has no authority. You understand? He's Amin, but he has no authority to make a decision. You could work with someone who is Makin and has a lot of authority, but is not Amin. The person has their own agenda. They're working behind my back to have their own agenda. But what you now want in a government that's about to head towards a disastrous economic situation? Like a famine is really what it is, right? Can you imagine? Like, it's not just the economy's going to dip and we have inflation. No, this is a famine, like no food, right? You want someone that's both, and the king gives him that authority. The king then gives him that authority. So we're going to close off this section, inshallah, and then wrap up. So ayah number 55. قَالَ اجْعَلْنِي عَلَى خَزَائِنِ الْأَرْضِ إِنِّي حَفِيظٌ عَلِيمٌ. So Yusuf proposed, he said, put me in charge of the storehouses of the land, for I am a knowing guardian. He says, put me in charge of the storehouses of the land. Who says this? Who does he say to? What can he deduce from this situation? Like, did the king come to him with an open job description? He said, hey, here's a job description, what do you think? What happened?
Yes,
I'm best at doing something, so.
Yeah,
He knows what's coming up, and maybe knows that he's the right person.
that's right, that's right. So the king is like, you're so impressive, you're amazing, I love you, I want you to bring you on. But I'm not sure, do you want to run the Ministry of Education, or should I have you run finance, or, and Yusuf said, no, I know exactly the job that I can help you with. I know the job, I know that the country's headed for a disaster, I will run the production of the economy for you. I'm going to become the Minister of the Economy. Minister of the Economy. So I will run these warehouses, the production lines for the farming, the people that we bring on board, the organization for the distribution, the warehouses, fulfillment centers. I'm going to manage all of that for the country for you. And you can see the king agrees. Question: is this position less than, equal to, or about the same as the king? Less than the king.
But it's going to be of tremendous importance in the coming years.
It's actually going to be higher than the king in coming years. It's going to be higher than the king. You know, when a country has a problem, let's say a country like this is about to go into a famine. The king making decisions on military and construction and education, like these are all important decisions. Is that going to be more important? Or the person running the crops and the land and the farms and the distribution of the warehouses? Who's going to become more important to be heading towards a famine? Those people. Those people are going to be more important. If you go to war, who's going to be more important than the king? The people. So Yusuf actually gets to a position coming out of prison and being sold as a slave as even more important than the king. Right? As even more important than the king. Okay, let's make it on, inshallah. And, inshallah. اللهم اغفر لنا وارحمنا وانت خير الراحمين ربنا تقبل منا انك انت السميع العليم وتب علينا انك انت التواب الرحيم اللهم اشف مرضانا ومرضى المسلمين اللهم اشف مرضانا ومرضى المسلمين اللهم اشف مرضانا ومرضى المسلمين وارحم موتانا وموتى المسلمين ربنا اغفر لنا ذنوبنا وكفر عنا سيئاتنا وتوفنا مع الابرار ربنا تقبل منا انك انت السميع العليم وتب علينا انك انت التواب الرحيم ربنا هب لنا من ازواجنا وذرياتنا قرة اعين واجعلنا للمتقين اماما واخر دعوانا ان الحمد لله رب العالمين جزاكم الله خيرا السلام عليكم